Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to FortneyScott's Employer Briefing. These monthly briefings address COVID pandemic-related updates and other developments affecting our society, including the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as key judicial, legislative, and policy changes. This briefing will be recorded. Everyone who registered today will be registered for all future employer briefings. I want to address some preliminary items before we begin. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's briefing will address how the Biden administration will affect the federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the incoming Biden administration, and congressional actions in the employment sphere. The actions by the federal agencies during the final days of the Trump administration, and the Biden administration's response to issues of inequality and diversity. The presenters are FortneyScott attorneys David Fortney, Nita Beecher, and Bert Fishman. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our briefing.
Valerie, thank you very much, and good day, everyone. It's so nice to see everyone. I want to wish everyone Happy New Year, and thank you for taking time from what I know is a very extraordinarily busy and demanding time for so many reasons. We want to make good use of the next 60 minutes we have the privilege of spending with you, so both Nita Beecher and Bert Fishman and I first just want to welcome you. Let me just say one or two preliminary matters, and then we'll dive right in. Just a word about who we are. Of course, we are a law firm. All three of us are lawyers in the law firm, and our practice involves focusing on the federal agencies that we're talking about today, involving the workplace as well as the Congress and related events in Washington, D.C. We have extensive experience in dealing with these matters, although I must say I'm not sure we have any direct experience in what we've seen over the last 7 days. But we certainly have a lot of experience in dealing with Washington, D.C. But of course, the purpose of today is to provide you with general information, and that we would encourage each of you to consult with an attorney of your choice, either your in-house counsel or experienced outside counsel, to understand specifically and on an attorney privilege basis about how these results may, in fact, impact your circumstance. So let's turn right to it. We have the developments that I think we all know, these images, and ones so similar I think have been burned into our minds starting from last Wednesday, and the troubling developments that go on. So what we'd like to first do is begin discussing really principally what has transpired. It feels like a month, but it's only in the last 7 days. Some of the COVID-related developments, and of course, the horrendous events that occurred at the U.S. Capitol. So, Nita, do you want to start? Let's start first with the agenda overall.
Yeah, certainly. Valerie? Okay, so we wanted to talk a little bit about the insurrection at the Capitol. There are a number of employer issues that arise out of that. Then obviously COVID and the vaccine, and I know Bert's going to talk a little bit about we did a whole webinar last week about it, but we're just going to talk a little bit about it from the Biden perspective. We're going to talk about the relief that Congress passed and the fact that the Democrats now will control on January 20th both houses of Congress. And then we have the Trump administration pushing through regulations. We call those the midnight regulations, which actually goes back to John Adams, who actually signed regulations at midnight, the second president of the United States. And what we expect from the Biden administration, we have a full cabinet, which we'll talk about. And finally, a little bit about what we see as the Biden administration initiatives around BLM issues. And I think, David, you're going to talk a little bit about the stark pictures from last Wednesday and what they may mean for the Biden administration. And with that, I turn it back over to Mr. Bert. Bert, you must be on.
I'm sorry, your audio is not working.
Sorry.
There you go.
very
There we
little
go.
more can
Yeah.
be added with respect to the pictures we see and what's happened. We would like everybody to know that we at FortneyScott, of course, are lawyers. We routinely represent clients before the federal government, and as a result, we rely utterly on the impartial application of the rule of law from that government. And like you, the very idea that the president, high-ranking members of the executive, powerful senators, and hundreds of members of the House would seek to undermine the Constitution and the very laws that they were sworn to uphold is a stain on the government that mere words will not eradicate. And all we can do is to tell you that as much as we are shaken by the rampage and stunned by the complicity, in the face of all that, we can assure you that we will be vigilant and vocal in our demands for equal justice under the law from the government. We also want to note that it's not just lawyers, it's employers throughout the country that are responding to what they've seen. We have heard reports that employers who have been seeing visual evidence of their employees, including high-ranking employees, including members of police forces, and they are taking action in terminating, suspending administrative leave. So the events of last week will reverberate and continue to reverberate throughout not merely the employment spheres, but throughout the entire country. And we join you in our stunned response and our assurance that we will continue to pursue the rule of law.
You know, one thing, Bert,
Nita,
you mentioned about the employers who are seeing evidence. Sometimes it's social media identifying people who work at their company. We have the CEO of a small company in Chicago who initially was suspended and ultimately fired. We have a sales representative who had the misfortune of parading through the Capitol with his corporate ID badge still clipped onto his Army fatigue wear he was wearing and being called out, and a wide range of people dealing literally from lawyers to state legislative representatives to marketing and sales reps, all sorts of professions at all levels of society. The uniform response, as employers learn of this, typically through social media, is that those employees typically are summarily terminated for their outside of work conduct because of the reputational damage to the company. And just a reminder, I hope none of you are in this situation, but if you do have employees that are involved in this, typically as an at-will employee, these actions, no matter how they try to argue them as First Amendment protected, that it does not limit your ability to impose sanctions up to and including termination of employment for their conduct outside the workplace. And we've seen some examples, and I think the more interesting will be, Bert mentioned some law enforcement who were directly involved, not defending, but as protesters, to use the most generic term, seeking entrance into the Capitol. They also may face discipline, and there may be collective bargaining agreements also that apply in those contexts. Nita, I wanted you also to touch on one or two trade associations and some of the other responses that have occurred.
So the National Association of Manufacturers on September of 2017, their president, Jay Timmons, introduced Mr. Trump as a true champion for our industry who has fought for manufacturing since day one of his presidency, now calls for him to be removed. That is not it's a huge employer association, very powerful. Now, there were some of the manufacturers didn't agree, but enough agreed that the board called for Trump's removal. In addition, David, there are many companies there are a number of companies who are refusing to give money to individuals who were involved in trying to overturn Biden's election. That would be senators and representatives who supported the frivolous claims that Biden was not elected. That was Marriott, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Commerce Bank, among just a few of them. And in addition, the banks, the big banks, JP Morgan, Citigroup, and others are, Goldman Sachs, are looking at they normally give 50-50 because they figure, they want to make sure they're on everybody's good side. They're now pausing any political contributions and reassessing their positions. So this is a big deal because normally businesses don't like to get involved in this kind of thing. And for them to take these kinds of stands, I think shows how shocked they were with what happened. David?
Exactly. No, I think that's right. And obviously a lot more to come, but the impact, this is going to, as Bert indicates, is going to radiate out to so many aspects of society, but
Right.
it will affect the workplace. It's going to affect conversations your employees may want to have. It certainly has affected
Correct.
conversations in our workplace. So being mindful of how to respond to that is something. So this is something that we are going to continue to monitor and we'll keep you abreast of on developments. Well, Nita, let's turn because really one of the other,
Sure.
it almost got lost,
Absolutely.
is the COVID. COVID is literally worse than it has ever been in our country, affecting the workplace and so many Americans. And can you please take the lead on the update for that as of this morning?
Well, this comes right out of the New York Times, as we always do. We have over 22 million cases. We have almost 375,000 deaths. On the day of I believe it was the day of the insurrection, 4,000 people died. And it's getting lost. In California in particular, Los Angeles, there's no place for the ambulance to take people. They're standing in line for 7-8 hours. It's completely out of control. And they now are concerned that when they moved all the representatives and senators to locations where they could be protected, they may have been exposed at that point. So they may have to quarantine. And they're concerned that by the end of January, there's going to be somewhere between 450 and 500,000 deaths from the COVID in the United States. So that has really slowed down the ability of states to reopen simply for that reason, David.
So the promise of course, people were heartened with Operation Warp Speed. Let's jump to the next slide, Valerie, please. Heartened with the announcement of Warp Speed and the development of vaccinations, or vaccine, I should say. But of course, the operative word that we're focused on now is vaccination. That is getting the vaccine
Right.
into our arms. And that is proving more challenging. And Nita has talked about some of the records that are set. Of course, under the concept of federalism, as the program has been administered so far by the Trump administration, that may change, and Bert will address that in a moment, in 9 days or so. But for the moment, the states have been given a great deal of autonomy to address the distribution and what it will look like. Most states have adopted following the CDC guidance of focusing on those that live in assisted living and the immediate healthcare workers, so-called not just Group 1, but Group 1A, and making sure that there is sufficient vaccine for those targeted recipients, initial recipients, to receive not only the first, but as we all know, a second dose has to be administered within 3 to 4 weeks, depending on the particular vaccine that's being administered. Some states, including Texas, Florida, Colorado, Alaska, have not focused so much on occupation or location. They have focused primarily on the greatest at-risk population and adopted a rule saying that those that are, in some instances, age 65 or older, others have said age 75 or older, but the older population will be vaccinated first because they are the most at risk. What we have seen, frankly, under both scenarios is a remarkable inability to deliver any sort of widespread penetration
Correct.
of vaccinations over the last couple of weeks. And there are lots of stories about people queuing up, desperately trying to get registered, for a brief time in Florida, they tried open whoever comes first, well, that was a disaster. They shut that down in a day or two. Palm Beach County, with President Trump's supposed home county at this point, the hotline, the telephone line, has been shut down. It fell apart. It had such a volume. And those that email it are told, we will get back to you. It may take weeks or months, and we will not be giving you an automated response. We can't even do that on our email. So, Nita.
Yeah. The other thing that's happening is because they aren't getting the distribution out quickly enough, they're starting to expire. So vaccines that are desperately needed are simply expiring because they can't get them out.
So this really underscores many employers, and Bert, I'm going to toss it to you in just a second to pick up and move us into the Biden team, but many employers are looking at extending the work from home. Many had presumed that the vaccinations would occur much more promptly and that they had lots of robust plans. Many are delaying that until the vaccination is much more widespread than it currently is. Bert.
Well, the issue, if we can go to the next slide, is the Biden plan, which is constantly having to be revised. The difficulty with the distribution is exactly a mirror image of the difficulty with the testing program, and the main problem in both cases is the lack of a national plan. To throw this onto the states, in many cases there have been reports over the weekend of state officials learning of their responsibilities like days before they were supposed to be in charge of distribution, with no knowledge of the number of vaccinations, with no knowledge of who's to be vaccinated, completely overwhelmed and completely without funding. President-elect Biden's first plan is to establish a national plan for the distribution of the vaccine. His continuing goal is 100 million inoculations in the first 100 days. The most controversial recent development along those lines was his insistence on releasing as much of the vaccine as we have to avoid the problem that David just mentioned about the expiration of these difficult to store vaccines. Very controversial within the medical community as to whether that's a wise tack. But currently, the position of the president-elect is to get as many vaccines out to as many people to turn vaccines into vaccinations. The Biden plan and the platform was to invest billions of dollars in increased manufacturing and distribution. The recent defense bill has something like $9 billion, the one that was just overridden by Congress, significantly less than the president-elect wants. He wants to assure that politics no longer plays a role at the FDA, that scientists are in charge, and that certainly seems to be true of the panel that the President-elect Biden has named, and will publicly release all scientific data. But the big problem now is getting from here to there, and the lack of a national plan, the absence of any organized distribution is, as I say, a continuation of the botched response to the COVID epidemic that we have seen in the past, and we hope for the best. But the current controversy is whether and to what degree the president-elect can get all this vaccine out quickly and create the distribution chain that is necessary to get the vaccines into people's arms.
I think that one key change, Bert, that we will see that President-elect Biden has indicated is that he will invoke the Defense Authorization Act, and this will allow, it won't simply rely on free market and incentivizing through economic incentives manufacturing. It will compel manufacturing to be done as a matter of national defense, and it's something it kind of puts us more on a war.
There's some difficulties in that because it may interrupt pre-existing contracts for the distribution of the vaccine worldwide, which the United States has in the past always regarded as one of their global responsibilities. So we will see how that develops.
Well, we will see, because I think what we do know is that as a result of the election, The current system, which we all agree isn't working well, there are plans to change it significantly, and we'll know within 2-3 weeks pretty quickly whether that's working or not. Well, let's switch
It's going to be a 25-hour first day.
Right.
So David, let me just quickly,
Nita, let's talk about some of the other ramifications of COVID. Yes.
Yeah, one of the things that there's been a lot of WARN litigation, and we early on in these briefings we warned about WARN, and in fact, Enterprise Holdings, which has 3 of the largest rental car companies and happens to be headquartered here in my St. Louis, just lost their initial attempt to dismiss a WARN case by their employees under the unforeseen business circumstances. The court rejected the idea. They said that the business downturn is what required the employer to lay people off, not the pandemic. As a result, it looks like they'll have to go forward with this case. So warning to employers that WARN does have a bite to it, and you do have to give as much notice as you can, and also continue to make sure that you accommodate employees around, as we discussed last week, both vaccinations and return to work, both religious and disability objections. And I think, David, with that, we're probably ready to turn to the next slide on what's next for Congress.
Right. So, again, in the week the insurrection, which has sort of captured and preoccupied everyone, but there were a number of momentous things that occurred at or about the same time. And the first was Senate-elect Warnock and Ossoff carrying both, the Democrats carrying both the Senate positions in the Georgia runoff. What does that mean? It means not today. It means effective January 20th, the Democrats will control both houses of Congress. And that is because it will be a 50-50 split at that point, starting January 20th. And of course, then Vice President Harris will have the tiebreaker votes, which is why it will be deemed to be a democratically controlled Senate. So that is a game changer in large part for much of what President-elect Biden wants to do. There was some concern about whether, if the Republicans controlled the Senate, would he really focus more to an executive order approach and not rely so much on congressional action during the first 100 days? Could it temper his nominations and who he might want to put in place because of the prospect of a Republican Senate playing havoc with those nominations? Well, he has a lane. The president-elect does have a lane. And note, however, that the filibuster rule is still there. So Congress is not just a rubber stamp, but it does provide much more, I'll say, maneuvering room. It makes it much more likely that the majority of nominees are going to get confirmed in fairly short order. This also has an impact with respect to judicial nominees. Indeed, the social media, as soon as this occurred, lit up and said, gee, Justice Breyer, don't you want to retire? That whole conversation has started. And the thought, and people say, well, what difference would that make? Wouldn't it just be one, quote, liberal justice replaced for a new liberal justice? But the thought is it's kind of a lesson learned by the passing of Justice Ginsburg, that as people increase in age, the likelihood of something occurring and not knowing what the political future holds, maybe you backfill or replace or put a bench in that's younger and statistically at least more likely to last for a longer period of time. That's one outcome. That isn't going to occur during the first 100 days, but it's a conversation that has already started. What is going to occur is certainly, first and foremost, nominees. That's the first thing to get the Biden administration running, and that will happen quicker than it would have before. The control of the committee and the committees of jurisdiction, the assignments, all of that controls what gets investigated, what gets looked at. Benghazi, forget about it. There's not going to be a review of Benghazi. That's done.
Biden-Hunter, forget
that will
about
be
it.
yeah, Biden-Hunter. I mean, that's all reduced to sort of the social edge, social media chit-chat, but it's not going to happen as part of congressional efforts. It does mean that there won't be as much of that distraction, and that there will be the ability, and I would suggest to you there may be one difference. There's probably, although not complete uniformity, that Biden may have a chance, particularly initially, to keep people harnessed, including his own left wing, a little bit harnessed on the agenda, at least initially. I predict that may begin to fracture out a little bit as time passes, but probably for the honeymoon, the first 100 days, I think that's likely to occur. So it's a big deal for the president, and will make a big difference in his first 100 days. Bert, please.
Yeah, the one thing about the committee assignments, which is critical in light of what's happened in the past week, there will be Democratic chairmen conducting the investigations into what happened on the 6th.
Yes,
and
exactly.
They will be thorough,
very important.
And they will be in a much higher and much heightened than it would have been otherwise. And we can look forward to that almost certainly.
Good. Well, let's talk about COVID, Bert, and Congress.
I'll be happy to. There were a couple things that happened while we were otherwise engaged. The most important, of course, was that Congress finally got a COVID relief bill passed. It was the first override of a congressional veto, of a presidential veto in two instances. One was the Defense Appropriation Bill, which has, by the way, $9 billion for COVID relief. And then there was the COVID relief bill. And the COVID relief bill promises a significant amount, less than was hoped for by some, but it promises $600 stimulus checks. It extends the unemployment benefits under the PUA, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Act, and additional funds under the Pandemic Unemployment Compensation Act. So those are all going to be extended for at least 13 and perhaps 26 weeks. Unfortunately, FFCRA paid leave did not get extended. However, a tax credit was made available to employers who wish to extend those voluntarily, but it is an employer option. The main thing, of course, is especially now with the Congress in Democratic hands, will be a very, very aggressive push to expand additional relief, whether it's going to be $2,000 benefit checks, which was the flavor du jour 2 weeks ago, or whether it will be a broader-based extension, protection against evictions, a broader extension of unemployment benefits, finally get some help for state and local governments. All of that is now front and center of the legislative agenda. But additional stimulations, additional sorts of things going forward, although much has happened that we didn't anticipate, especially the overrides over the past 2 weeks, much to be occurred. Everybody has to remember, however, that the Trump budget was passed. That was one of the last things that happened at the end of last year. And those really do provide significant limitations on expenditure of funds to repopulate the agencies, to repopulate various elements of the government. And as we've noticed in the past, personnel is policy, and unless you can get the right people conducting and effectuating your policies, you will be limited. And the difficulty is the budget is what the budget is. We have learned in the past 4 years that the president has been given significant authority to reallocate funds. You might remember all of those wall cases, taking money from the defense budget and moving it to the wall. Well, perhaps under those Supreme Court precedents, President-elect Biden can do the same to reallocate funds to fund his initiatives. But that, again, remains to be seen and is one of the many, many pending issues. But relief has been passed. We have step one. It is significant, but there is much more to be done.
Well, you mentioned personnel,
and why don't
Bert,
we move,
and that's really a very good
Nita,
segue to just Talk about what the new cabinet will look like, because there's been a lot of fanfare on that, Nita.
Well, if you take a picture of a Trump cabinet and you put it up against the Biden cabinet, you will notice something very different. There is, not only are there many more diverse people, including the first Native American, who is Deborah Holland. She is the first Native American to be a cabinet member. You've got the first woman to head the Treasury Department. You have an African American heading the Department of Defense. And so many of these people have years and years of experience in the government. They're very well, they know how the government works. And I think all in all, President-elect Biden is to be applauded. However, this is basically a moderate group of people. And I think you're going to see the progressive wing, as David just mentioned, want to get their oar in the water at some point. Now, many of these people probably aren't going to stay for the whole time, but it does seem like they're trying to put some more progressives. For example, in the Department of Justice, they've put a couple of people in the Civil Rights Division and other places who come from the civil rights world, who head civil rights agencies. So, David, I think that you're going to see. But most importantly for us, David, you want to talk about the nominee for the Department of Labor, who is on the next slide, Marty Walsh.
Absolutely. So Mayor Walsh, tomorrow he is going to be delivering his annual budget and State of the City update to Boston. And next week we'll start his formal status as a nominee when his nomination is formally submitted for review by the newly democratically controlled Senate. Marty Walsh is a card-carrying union member. He's a member of the Building Trades Union. He has developed an interesting reputation. He's someone that President-elect Biden knows, someone that President-elect Biden likes, someone that President Biden-elect clearly feels comfortable with. And as one of the members of the transition team mentioned to me, they were delighted, their thought being, this gives us, and by us, remember, labor is the only cabinet representative for all the civil rights, all the NLRB, EEOC, all the agencies. It's the labor secretary who's the cabinet official. As the transition team member was saying, this gives us a seat at the adult table. We know that when push comes to shove, that as the president tries to deal with all the issues that America is facing, domestic issues, the labor secretary is going to be in that inner circle. And that is critically important. And it is critically important as you look at the president's agenda, and we've talked about this in the past for the first 100 days. We know that one of the first things coming out of the blocks, and we know that Walsh himself has been very involved in diversity, equity, inclusion. He has led a number of programs in the building trades, which has not enjoyed broad diversity, but a number of efforts to develop pipelines, to develop training programs, to overtly increase diversity. He has worked hard and successfully to do that in job creation in Boston. He's been very mindful of that. And Boston is a city that has historically had its share of challenges. And I think he's received very good marks from people on all points of the compass for those efforts. So he's someone that, if you will, gets it. He will understand what Davis-Bacon Act is. He understands what workplace health and safety, pension issues. He's someone that understands the mission of the Labor Department. One of the other things that we know right out of the box, the Labor Department is going to be grappling with, of course, is an emergency temporary standard, a COVID standard for OSHA. And we have noted that. I think that that's something you can expect will occur very quickly. We do anticipate, every indication we have is that every sub-agency, sub-cabinet position that does not require confirmation, for example, the head of OFCCP, the deputy in wage hour, the deputy at OSHA, those do not require Senate confirmation. They are selected by the administration and can be put in place immediately. We anticipate that within the first 7 days, and maybe less, many of those key positions will be filled. Why is that important? This goes to what Bert was mentioning before about how quickly things are going to change. Usually there is this interim period where you have senior career people as acting, and they are concerned, considerate, but they're caretakers. They don't want to get too far out of the lane. They're trying to anticipate what their new bosses will want, but they don't want to upset the status quo. So it's an awkward position for them. This administration is saying, look, we're going to minimize that caretaking period to hours or days. We're going to put people in as deputies that can immediately start implementing our agenda. And frankly, with a Democratic-controlled Senate on the confirmation, it lowers the risk that the changes that might be put in place will be used to forestall confirmation. Nita.
One last thing, David, the unions felt like under the Obama administration that they really didn't, to be honest, get very much. Biden he's very supportive of the unions, so I expect you're going to see a lot of changes around the rules for unions and for organizing and for workers' rights.
I just want to underscore, we've said it before, we anticipate those changes through federal contractor new obligations and potentially through legislation, including the PRO Act, including some of the civil rights legal reforms. So, well, let's sort of transition, Nita, a little bit to the Trump administration still has 9 days, and they're busy.
Yeah, so we're going to go from the midnight regulations, as we mentioned earlier, to the dawn of the Biden administration. And I think, Bert, you're the first up to talk about wage and hour that's continuing to work very hard.
Wage and hour throughout the Trump administration has been the most energetic, the most effective, and all political interests aside, pretty much right down the center in terms of the kinds of regulations we can anticipate from a Republican administration. The most recent and the most important and the most anticipated, of course, was the DOL independent contractor regulation, which was issued on the 7th of January. This followed very closely the proposed regulation. It follows very closely to the NLRB regulation and to the previously published wage and hour opinion letter. It puts great emphasis on two main factors, which are entrepreneurial endeavors of individual contractors and whether a worker really runs his own business. That being said, the Biden administration has already announced it's going to freeze this regulation more or less on day one and find ways to suspend it. We don't want to get into the inside baseball of whether it's a legislative or a statutory regulation, but they're going to try to stop this one way or the other. The Congressional Review Act, which David will talk in greater depth later, creates a possibility, but it's a double-edged sword. If you rescind it, you may not be able to re-regulate. There is one thing in this regulation that we should point out. Rather surprisingly, the DOL's independent contractor regulation provided a mechanism for delivering some form of benefits, mainly pension and some access to health benefits, has never before been done that would permit an independent contractor to get those benefits and yet keep an independent contractor status. This is clearly a response to Proposition 22 in California, the Uber regulation that you may know about. But even more importantly, it's beginning to an indication that these two camps, these kind of two icebergs that are just frozen in place, are beginning to melt. And their Congress is trying to recognize that we have millions, tens of millions of independent contractors, not just plumbers and electricians, but artists and writers and coders, and not just food deliverers. So it's an important indication that there is some effort to bring our labor laws more and more closely to the economy of the 21st century. But that regulation will be frozen. There's no doubt about it. It's been announced officially. But wage and hour has also been busy on other fronts. We've already talked last month and indicated that a tip pool regulation was going to be finalized. It mainly permits the tips to be spread among more workers at a restaurant or a hotel, but it also gives managers more authority to distribute those. There were 4 more opinion letters just over the past week.
2 weeks?
Quite literally the past week, mainly having to do with how you deal with the 541 regulations, the continuous day regulations of who's exempt and who isn't. But the most important was a regulation expanding and addressing and applying the Supreme Court's decision in Lady of Guadalupe on the ministerial exception. Basically, what not surprisingly and not radically, the Wage and Hour Administration applied the Supreme Court's ruling and gave to administrators of religious schools the authority to determine who fit as someone who is furthering the religious goals of the institution, and essentially gave religious school administrators the right to remove teachers from the protections of the Fair Labor Standards Act. That is to say, whether they're exempt or non-exempt, or the salary basis test. As I say, not a surprise in light of the Sisters of Guadalupe, but the indistinct limits on that rule may be an area where the Wage and Hour Administration will re-regulate to try to narrow and focus the limits of that ruling. But very active, and I think they'll keep going to the very last day.
Yep.
Can I just add one thing, Nita, as we transition to OFCCP?
Please.
Sure.
The opinion letters, in discussing some of those with the transition team, I pled specifically, please don't just throw them all out. They can be rescinded immediately.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. The transition team representative said, you know what? Even though we don't necessarily agree with them, we actually think some of these interpretations are correct, and we're not going to, on a wholesale basis, simply toss them. Number 2, practice pointer, I would not rely, as Bert indicated, on that new independent contractor gig worker regulation.
Yeah.
I just would not build my compliance program based on that reg, because it has a pretty short shelf life. All right, Nita, OFCCP.
Right. Okay.
Let's hear what's going on
well,
there. Next slide.
First and foremost is our friend 13950, the Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping. It's out. It was a federal district court judge in California. I know you're shocked. California issued a nationwide injunction. It was a lawsuit that had been filed by groups that provide diversity training to federal contractors. The judge felt that they would be successful in showing that the executive order violated the First Amendment. Bert would agree with us, by the way. The First Amendment due process clause, and basically was too vague. It was vague. It was void for vagueness, right, Bert? Void for vagueness.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing, David, was that you and I heard Director Lean say literally as soon as they got this, OFCCP shut everything down. It shut down the hotline that we talked about. They had over 200 complaints, and it stopped doing anything around investigating them. So they're completely shut down. I think part of that too is that with the Biden administration coming in, they know that's going to all go away. But anyway, so that was pretty interesting. Anything else before I jump over? Yes, Bert.
Nope.
The only thing to point out is that the resistance within the OFCCP to this regulation is demonstrated by the speed to which the agency responded to a district court ruling, and quite obvious. Let's move on.
Yep. Next one, please. So, like Wage and Hour, OFCCP has been incredibly busy. They issued the very controversial final religious freedom regulations that we've talked about. They also issued now, in interesting contrast, they issued the freedom regulations, and in a webinar that Director Lean held on Friday around the religious freedom regulations, he made a couple of points, David, that I just want to read. He pointed out that this religious freedom, all this is, he says, the regulations are to get more religious organizations to be federal contractors, and it does not authorize invidious discrimination against protected classes or cause protections to categorically disappear. He also said the purpose of the rule is not to allow discrimination based on protected status, even with LGBT employees. And in a way, something that the Institute has been trying to do since they first started talking about this OFCCP finally issued an opinion letter more around what are employers' obligations with respect to religious accommodation. When do they actually have to provide it? And they issued an opinion letter, which I think came out today. It probably came out at the same time as the webinar. It was dated on Friday. And in that, they reinforce what's required for employers and give a lot of examples, which I think are really helpful. Then we have the agency is continuing to issue IRCAs. I know we believe that IRCAs have been a really good thing. They issued a report on the ombudsman, their ombuds, and they're going to issue a report on 503. And they are supposedly moving forward on some of these new focus reviews. We'll just have to wait and see. Anything else, David, on OFCCP?
Nope.
But I think the ball goes to you with that.
They're moving.
EEOC?
They're moving along. Well, let's talk about EEOC. Now, recall that the EEOC, that although the president has the right to designate a new chair, and of course he will do so, there are 2 Democrats and 3 Republicans. So what that means in practical terms is the new chair can determine what the EEOC will vote on or will not vote on. She can drive the agenda. And my sources indicate that it's probably likely to be Charlotte Burrows, who will be designated as the chair, at least initially. But the new chair then will have only 2 Democratic votes and 3 Republican votes among the 5 EEOC commissioners, which means that although the chair can determine the agenda, the chair more likely than not may not have the votes to make the changes that they want. And that informs what is going on in terms of the last days of the Trump administration, where the current chair, Chair Dillon, who does have 3 votes, 3 Republican members, Member Lucas and Vice Chair Sonderling, are very aggressively holding a series of meetings and voting on a number of changes that will make a difference. Last week, they voted on the conciliation changes that make conciliation more transparent, that provide greater obligations on the EEOC to actually inform the charging party what the basis of their claims are. Later this week, at the end of the week, the effort will be to further remove some of the autonomous authority that the General Counsel has and to return to the commissioners themselves the decisions on which litigations are filed or not filed. And then finally, later this week, there also will be a renewed focus on religious guidance that will be voted on by the commission. Why is all of that important? Because assuming that all those commission votes line up and that Chair Dillon has the votes, she does, those changes will be in place, and it will be very hard, at least for the first year or so, until the Biden administration ends up with a majority of 3, to change those policies. So and that is why Chair Dillon is working very hard to put these changes in place to see if she can put the stamp on of these changes that I would add are generally very favorable for employers, that we think generally restore a needed sense of balance to the EEOC proceedings. But these hearings are very unusual. They don't occur very often in the EEOC, and we've been having rapid fire hearings. Another example of agency conduct, very substantive, that's kind of gotten lost with the tidal wave of other news that's just washed over Washington. But these changes will impact the agency for the next 12 to 18 months, we believe. So let's go from there, Bert, to the first steps in the next administration at DOL.
Well, David, you mentioned most of these, and I have very little to add. The main point is because of the impeachment hearings and because of those sorts of measures in response to the insurrection, the confirmation of secretaries may be delayed. But David has already pointed out the main thing that's going to happen is that very experienced professionals will be appointed on day one as actings in various positions. Every agency will be staffed. The big challenge for this administration, of course, is can they deal with the new realities that they face them, both with COVID, both with budget, and now with the insurrection. And in light of the time, David, let's move on to more specific policy measures.
Sure, be happy to. So, with respect to what to expect, I think we have really covered most of these about the midnight regulations, the COVID standard that we expect, the change with respect to various rules on joint employer. One thing I really want to highlight for just a moment is the Congressional Review Act, the CRA, and whether that will or will not be used to rescind some of the regulations. This is another potential, if you will, weapon that is there for the new administration to use. Ordinarily, a regulation, once it's been promulgated, it has to go through notice and comment and a variety of steps that is measurable in months and often a year or more to be rescinded and changed. The Congressional Review Act, with a simple majority vote, so we can go back in both houses of Congress, there would be that requisite majority, assuming a party line vote. Congress can say, we're hereby saying this regulation is rescinded. But a Congressional Review Act rescission has greater impact than that because it not only rescinds the regulation, it precludes the agency from promulgating any regulations that are substantially similar. Those are the words in the statute. They have never been judicially interpreted. So, for example, would the democratically controlled Congress want to rescind the joint employer regulation that Bert described for us? That might be attractive because you could rescind it right away. The obvious negative would be it would preclude them from their own joint employer regulation and codifying the ABC test, which is what we have in California. So I think the CRA, although the good news for the incoming administration, they've got the votes to use it. The practical reality is that many of the areas they want to rescind, they want to enact their own regulations, and CRA would preclude that. So that's a tool that I don't think will be used much. We continue to believe that federal contractors are going to see a lot of new obligations, including new regulations on pay reporting, and a host of additional requirements. So, Nita, let me turn to you on any other limitations you see on the new administration.
I think we've covered them all. I think the biggest issue is the fact that we have the EEOC commissioners and the board have terms, and those terms end. Janet Dillon is in until July of 2022. The only one we might see is the NLRB General Counsel, Peter Robb, who is hated by the unions with a pink and purple passion. He goes out in November 17th of 2021. I don't know if they'll just wait, but they may try to fire him. That's not ever been done, but who knows? And we've already talked about hollowing out. So David, with that, let's turn to our last couple of slides and talk a little bit about Biden administration and BLM.
Well, this is, again, one of the real tests. This is one of the real tests of the administration. How do you make policy and statutory changes that create an inclusive nation in light of what's happened? It is pretty clear that the Biden administration is intent on using the power of the federal government to further social justice measures, initiatives, statutes, regulations. They are certainly going to implement pay data collection to improve pay equity for women and minorities. Whether this will move into statutory Fair Pay Act remains to be seen in light of the filibusters in Congress. There will certainly be a refocus on paid leave, on child care, universal pre-K. The main issue, the one that President-elect Biden campaigned on, was expanding the ACA. We think all of those are in the works. The main issue, in light of the 70 million people who voted for President Trump and the conduct we saw just last week, is to create a belief that we as a country have common interests and common goals that we can work together to achieve. And that has frankly been the goal of this country for over 200 years. And we now have another chance to see if we can renew ourselves. Let's move on.
Well, and we saw the issue with respect to Black Lives Matter and some of those societal issues played out again last week, and it was pointed out both by the president and vice president-elect, who noted the disparate results and treatment of the protesters last week versus the protests that occurred on what is now known as Black Lives Matter Plaza. and President Biden, elect Biden, called it out directly. He said it's not acceptable.
Yeah.
If those were black protesters, they would have been treated very differently, and
Yeah.
recommitted that America is going to come to grips with this and deal with it. We all hope he's right, but it informs and animates. So it's not a slogan. It is something that is genuine. And I do think that some of the points that are on this slide will be addressed. But the bigger question, as Bert points out, is whether the kind of the vision, the dialogue, the country's kind of psyche can actually be changed and broadened to address these issues. It's a huge challenge. It is perhaps the most fundamental challenge.
We began with the notion that this was e pluribus unum, one from many. And it appears over the last 20 years that it's become every man for himself. It has to be the goal of everybody in government and everybody in the country to get back to that original goal, one from many.
Agreed. All right, Nita. Well, our time has just about run. Why don't you kick us off, please,
Sure.
on what we've covered? Good luck summing that up. What are the key takeaways?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I think the thing that we kind of lost with the insurrection last week is COVID is just it's worse than ever. The vaccine rollout is not very good. One of the pictures we showed the line of people in Florida trying to get vaccines. And the country is awaiting a president who's actually going to step up and try and do something about it. And with that, I think we turn to Mr. Fortney.
Yes, thank you. So Congress, it is frankly, I think, surprising to most that the Democrats won both the seats in Georgia. It is surprising that those candidates won, particularly in Georgia. But I predict that for the first 50 days, perhaps, of the Biden administration, there will be some level of unity. I think that will begin to fray fairly quickly because there is not a uniform vision on where the country should go and how it should get there.
Right.
Both within the Democrat, both within the administration itself, just as there's an erupting civil war within the Republican Party. So Washington, I think, is going to be very fractured. Congress will inevitably reflect that, as it so often does. And I think it's going to create lots of challenges for all of us in terms of our workforce and compliance issues. Bert?
I think the important thing to remember in light of all of the chaos, and there will be chaos in the first days of Congress as well, that the Biden administration understood, because they didn't think they would have a congressional majority, they have people in the wings ready to run the agencies of the government starting on day one, and we expect that to happen. There will be familiar names and there will be familiar policies, but we're not going to have a 120-day transition and running in. It's going to start on the 21st with people who know what they're doing.
Yeah, I was going to say, and finally, in the remaining 9 days, whatever happens to President Trump, whether he is removed, censured, impeached, or whatever may happen, the agencies continue to run. The agencies, and we've highlighted those changes that are pending, those are going to be completed. Any change that may occur or actions relating to President Trump are just that. The agencies are going to continue. They will finish their midnight efforts, and wage hour and EEOC particularly are going to finish strong. And we need to be very mindful of that and understand how those last minute changes are then treated. So the next 30 to 40 days are going to be very uncertain periods for employers in understanding the new rules of the road that we face. So with that, I want to really thank both Bert and Nita for another briefing in what has been a very, very challenging period. We hope all of you will join us in 1 month on February 8th. We will be talking about the Biden administration and how it's doing, as it will just be 2 weeks or so into the new administration. So Valerie, with that, I'll let you close us out. Thank you both again.
Thank you.
We would like to thank you for joining us. As a reminder, all registrants from today have been registered for future briefings, and you may view this briefing as well as our previous employer briefings on our website at www.FortneyScott.com. The next monthly briefing will be February 8th. Be on the lookout for additional updates, which will be sent via email. Later today, you will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You are able to submit some suggestions for future topics through the survey. Thank you in advance for completing this survey, and of course, if you have any questions, you may submit them via email to info@FortneyScott.com.